Varying terminology. In this module, I want to look at how the Vav consecutive has been termed or referred to by different grammarians. Now this is a just for fun module. It's a little different than the other modules we've dealt with. You can get along quite well in first year Hebrew without ever encountering this or ever dealing with this. But I wanted to introduce this for a couple of reasons. One is so that if you're talking to another student or someone who has learned their Hebrew from a different textbook that uses a different terminology, you're at least aware that the different terminology is out there. And even if you forget the details of this module, you can go and look it up. So one is just to be aware of the various terminologies. And secondly is because when we look at this, we can see a little bit about how people have thought about the Vav consecutive by how they named it. And that's useful. So I wanted to introduce six different ways that the Vav consecutive is referred to. And then at the end I'll give a little bibliography outlining examples of textbooks that use these various different terms. Okay, the first one here, we'll start with this one because this is the one that we're using, the Vav consecutive. And this is used by Ross, which is the textbook that we're following in these modules, also by Seo and Winegreen. And again, I'll talk about these grammars at the end. The focus here is on narrative sequences, on the idea of consecutive elements in a sequence. Okay, now I don't really have to introduce this to you because we've already looked at this. We have our perfect and our imperfect. And the preterite plus Vav consecutive is our past tense, past time narrative sequence. And perfect plus Vav consecutive is our future time narrative sequence. So this is the chart that I'm asking you to memorize. Now I threw in here plus or minus Vav conjunctive just to emphasize that the Vav conjunctive can exist here too. And it is different, of course, from the Vav consecutive. So both of these, the perfect can have a Vav conjunctive, just a normal Vav, and the imperfect can have a normal Vav conjunctive. Now remember that this Vav consecutive looks different from this Vav conjunctive, but this Vav consecutive looks the same as this Vav conjunctive. And so for the future time narrative, or with the perfect, you have to go by context, right? Because this one looks like this, and this one looks like that. Okay, well, we've seen the Vav consecutive. That's one way to talk about these things. Talk about this special Vav consecutive. The second is to talk about, or another way is to talk about the Vav conversive. And this focuses on the apparent reversal of meaning. Remember, we have this sort of flip going on. We have the perfect here is generally used for the past, or often used for the past. But then when you move into the sequentials, as opposed to non-sequential, we use the perfect now with this special Vav, and it looks like this special Vav is converting the perfect into a future. And conversely, we have what looks like the imperfect, the same form as the preterite, and it looks like this special Vav is converting it into a past because this is used for the past time narrative sequence. And so grammars like Kittelhofer and Wright, as well as Lambden, use this terminology, imperfect plus Vav conversive, and perfect plus Vav conversive, or the converted imperfect, converted perfect. So it's as if this special Vav is converting a verb form from a past to a future and a future to a past. Now Lambden is the first text I used, which is probably why I sometimes flip into using Vav conversive instead of Vav consecutive. So, okay, so that's a second way. A third way is Vav inversive. This also focuses on the apparent reversal of meaning, this flip that goes on. And this is the terminology used by Juan Maroca. Now, just to give you a little history here, Paul Juan wrote a grammar in 1923 in French, and then Maroca translated that grammar and revised it and published it first in 1991. So that is the grammar we're talking about, the one that's revised by Juan Maroca. It's just generally referred to as Juan Maroca. And he, or they, I'm not sure where this term originates with which one of these two fellows, but they use the term inversion, vav inversive, and so the sequences are called the inverted future and inverted perfect. Interestingly, he refers to this as the perfect, which is what Ross does, and instead of saying imperfect, he actually calls it the future. So we have future, and then we have inverted future and inverted perfect. Now, he says that he uses the term inversion rather than, or inversive rather than converted, because he wants to capture both the inversion of meaning and the inversion or the shifting of the stress. I mentioned briefly that in the inverted perfect, or the perfect plus vav consecutive, you can get a stress shift. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a later module. You can also get a stress shift in the inverted future in some forms, and it goes the other direction. So you have stress shifts in opposite direction, and that's why he wants to use this term to help to include that. Anyway, it's very similar really to the vav conversive. Vav relative. This is another term, another way that people refer to this special vav, and this is the term that is used by Waltke O'Connor, this focuses on the relation between verbs, focuses on one verb's relation to the situation described by the previous verb. And so this is similar to the vav consecutive. It's emphasizing how one verb relates to a previous verb. And he refers, or Waltke O'Connor, they refer to the perfect as the suffix conjugation and the imperfect as the prefix. So here they're focusing on the form. They're naming these tenses by their form, not how they're used. Suffix just because it has suffixes, and prefix because the imperfect is marked by having prefixes. And then they refer to the vav relative plus prefix conjugation and vav relative plus suffix conjugation. So vav relative is another way to talk about this special vav. And then we have vav hipuch. Now, hipuch, vav hipuch is the term that was used by the first grammarians. And the first grammarians were Jewish grammarians in the medieval period. And vav hipuch means vav of overturning. So you can see that what they were focusing on or seeing was this converting idea, the overturning vav. It would change a past into future and a future into a past. The other vav, the normal vav, they called vav chebur, which means vav of joining, so just connecting. Then later, the early Christian Hebraists just took their terminology and converted it into Latin. So vav hipuch, vav of overturning, became vav conversivum, or vav conversive, and the vav chebur became vav conjunctivum in Latin, or vav conjunctive. So that's how this terminology, or where this terminology has come from. And so it's really a historical term that's focusing on this conversion idea. And Randy Booth uses that in his Hebrew material. Now, Booth, when he starts at the beginning of his introduction to this, he simply calls the perfect and the imperfect past and future, just as a first way to think about it. And then he refers to the sequence tenses as sequential past and sequential future. So you notice here that he's kind of hiding the fact, or at least in these terms hide the fact that this form is related to this, and this form is related to this. So he's just focusing here on the function. Later on, he'll give a more nuanced linguistic description. He talks about definite tense aspect, indefinite tense aspect. So here he's emphasizing that these tenses are more than just time. There's time and there's type of action. Both are there. So anyway, this is the historical term, the Jewish medieval term. And lastly, we have transliteration. Now this one is a little different. This way of talking about these tenses, these forms, focuses on the form rather than the function. And this is used by many grammarians, Booth, João Maroca, Seo, Waltke O'Connor. In addition to the other terms, they'll use this sometimes. Um, and you want to use this when you don't want to talk about how it's used. You simply want to talk about the form. It's a neutral way of talking about these various forms. So we have katal. This is the perfect, or what we call the perfect. We have vkatal, which is the perfect plus vav consecutive or vav conjunctive. This doesn't distinguish because it's not talking about form. It's just talking about, sorry, it's not talking about function. It's just talking about the form. So v could be either vav. Yiktol is our imperfect. And vayiktol is the imperfect in terms of form plus the vav consecutive. And the vayiktol is imperfect plus vav conjunctive. So vayiktol, vayiktol. And here, this way of talking about these verbs emphasizes that we can morphologically distinguish vav consecutive over here from vav conjunctive with the imperfect because they are different. This one here is this, and this one here is our vav, that's our w, our patach, and our doubling. We have two yuds here because you're doubling the yud. Okay? So this is a way of talking about these forms just by referring to their form. It's really just a transliteration, a rough transliteration. And why do they call it katal and yiktol? Well, it comes from the choice of paradigm verb. We are using pakad in Ross as our paradigm verb. So pakad here. Many grammars use katal. So it's just a different verb. And you see here katal is just this. This katal, yiktol, this is yiktol. Vayevkod or vayiktol, that's what this is. So these are just simply transliterations of the form, the 3ms form for the various types here. And just to emphasize this again, because I don't think I talked about it too much, this here is the vav conversive. Vav, patach, with the little dagesh there. And this one here is vav conjunctive, right? Vav with a shava, and then the imperfect form. Okay, it's important to distinguish these two, because they do look different. With this one, we can't tell. This here could be either a vav conjunctive or a vav consecutive. We have to go by context. Okay, so those are the 6 ways of talking about this special vav. You can come back and look at this later when you encounter it and you forget these details. We're going to use the term vav consecutive, preterite plus vav consecutive for the vayiktol. That's what Ross uses, and perfect plus vav consecutive. Okay, a couple more things. This is from Waltke O'Connor. This gives us the breakdown of frequency of usage of these different forms. And this is rather interesting. We see that the katal, or the perfect, and the imperfect are used pretty much about the same, as well as the vayiktol, about 30%, a little less. So we see this is used actually the most, just by a touch. But this is our past tense narrative sequence. So this is how you tell stories. So that's why it's used so much. Vkatal, now this includes both the consecutive and the conjunctive form, because this way of talking about doesn't distinguish. But both of them together are only 13%. So you can tell by this that the future time narrative sequence is used less than the past time narrative sequence. And then vayiktol, simply and plus the imperfect, is significantly less, only 3%. Okay, and lastly here I've got, this is the bibliography of the various grammars that I've referred to that use these different terminologies. So let me just go through these briefly. Randall Booth here, this is Living Biblical Hebrew for Everyone, Level 2. You can do a search for this on the web and find his website where he's selling his book. He is approaching things a little differently than everyone else on this page. He's trying to teach Hebrew so that you can speak it, biblical Hebrew. And so this is very interesting. He has a pile of audio that goes with his I almost want to call it a grammar. I want to call it a Hebrew learning book. And then at the end, he gives his more linguistic, more nuanced linguistic explanation of the verb system. but he's the one who uses the vav hipuch. Then we have Juan. This is the one, Paul Juan, revised and translated by Maroka, Juan Maroka, 1996. This one is an advanced grammar, and Waltke O'Connor is also an advanced grammar. This one, Waltke O'Connor focuses more on syntax, and Juan Maroka goes through the whole gamut, right from phonetics right up to syntax. They are both books that I would recommend getting after you move on beyond first year. These are the two advanced grammars that are in this list. Kittel, Hoffer, and Rebecca Wright. This is a grammar that I haven't used in class, but I've read through it a couple times. It's a nice review. I don't know that I like it as a first intro. I think it's a bit too inductive, but it's a great review. Landon is the first textbook I used. It's a classic, and he uses vav conversive, which is why I sometimes flip into that. Ross is the text that we're using right now for for these modules here, 2001. So it's a fairly recent publication, although he was using it for years, teaching it before he published it. And Seo, I also used that text. This is for a first-year grammar textbook. It's a little more detailed than most, so he'll give a little bit more of a nuanced explanation for things. It makes a nice, almost like a first-year reference book. And Winegreen. Winegreen is a classic, been around for a long time, a bit dated now, but I put it in here because, well, I have it on my shelf, and a lot of people have used Winegreen. So, the special vav, what we call the vav consecutive, can be referred to in different ways as we've gone through, and it's some of the terminology emphasizes the converting nature, so it's either called conversive or inversive, or vav hipuch. Other terminology emphasizes the fact that one verb is related to the previous verb. There's this consecutive thing going on, so vav consecutive, vav relative, both emphasize that. And then there's the transliteration terminology, which just refers to the form without talking about the function, sort of a neutral terminology, the katal, yaktol, vayaktol, vakatal, and vayaktol.